Can you introduce yourself, your background and your expertise, as well as your current role?
My name's Barbrook-Johnson. I'm a lecturer in the geography department here at Oxford. I'm also a researcher in the Institute for New Economic Thinking. And probably most relevant for today is that I'm also the deputy director of the Agile Initiative. My own research interests are really kind of at the intersection of kind of economics and sociology. I'm a social scientist by background. I mainly work on environmental and energy policy topics, and I do a lot of work, kind of co-created work with policymakers in that space, both in the UK but also elsewhere.
Okay, so can you tell us about the Agile Initiative?
So the Agile Initiative is a NERC-funded program, quite a large program. It started about 2.5 years ago. The aim of the program and what NERC were trying to get Oxford's help with was to think about this interaction between evidence, scientific evidence, and the policy-making process. So it's about rethinking how we provide and how researchers act to provide evidence into the policy-making process, and that interaction between science and research and the policy-making process. In practice, there's 3 core things that we're doing. One is we're running a whole bunch of what we call research sprints. These are individual projects in their own right, which are focused on specific policy questions or needs. We're also doing quite a lot of work on community building and capacity building, working with researchers from early career right through to senior professors to think about what they need and how they can be part of a more active community to engage with the policy process more. And then lastly, we're also working with institutions and thinking about how they incentivize or not, and how they value or not the type of more applied, co-created research that we do in Agile.
So what does an Agile Initiative research sprint entail exactly?
So the sprints, which are really the workhorse of what we do, are meant to be very clearly defined, relatively rapid, focused research projects. So they're research projects in their own right. Sprints should have a very clear policy pull or need that we're addressing. They should be timely. There should be a reason why we need to do this now and why we need to do it in 6 to 12 months. These sprints should be very strongly co-created with a set of stakeholders, partners, and probably there's 1 or 2 key partners that are particularly strongly involved. They should be interdisciplinary, both between the natural and social sciences, the engineering sciences, the physical sciences, or maybe within some of those fields. And then lastly, the sprint should have a really strong commitment to equality, impact, and diversity and inclusion. And so that's both on who's doing the research, but also what the research is about and the types of voices and narratives that are given emphasis in that research.
So you mentioned co-creation processes as part of Agile Sprints. How does stakeholder input shape the different research questions that you look at and the different methodologies that you use as part of the sprints?
There's 2 big key stages where I think co-creation happens, or it's always happening, but there's 2 particularly crux points, I think. One is when the topics of our sprints first emerge. So that's either a research team works with a partner to develop an idea and then puts that to us in one of our calls, or it might be that us as the kind of central Agile team have gone out and spoken to different institutions about questions they would like researchers to work on, and we co-create a topic with them and then put that out to our researchers to respond to. And then the second stage, which I think is maybe less obvious but is a very key stage for us, is once we have a topic, before we fund it, before the money actually flows and people start working, we have a co-creation stage where we finalize the plan and kind of write up, it's quite short, but we write up a proposal, a final proposal to be approved by our various kind of decision-making bodies within Agile.
You also mentioned interdisciplinarity. How do you assemble and manage the diverse teams that address the challenges in the research sprints?
We don't strongly curate the team. So we don't actively force the teams to be interdisciplinary. And we don't kind of say to people, you guys should work together. So there's none of We don't do that. We let researchers kind of build their own teams, but that is then something we judge sprint ideas on. I think what often happens is that interdisciplinary nature is kind of forced on us also by the questions policy partners have, whether it's public sector, NGOs or industry. The questions they ask us to work on and want to work on with us are inherently kind of cross-domain and across disciplines, and often have governance or economic or social dimensions on top of a more fundamental natural science question, maybe.
In the same vein, how do you ensure that inclusion and positive equality impact is upheld in the Agile Sprints?
Yes, we do a lot of work on this. What that's all kind of translated into kind of formally, in a sense, I think is two particular key things. One is we have an EDI plan as a program. And so we have a very long list of kind of actions and things we need to be doing regularly to make sure we're active in this space and reflecting. That's published on the Agile website. Then on individual sprints, there's kind of two things that happen. One is that they are judged. Every sprint, there's on the application form, you have to fill in, it says, what's going on in this space with your sprint? How are you addressing this type of issue? And then so there's that element, and our panels that assess the sprint ideas, judge them on that. There's also the actual formal process, an even more formal process for that, where we ask sprints that move into this second stage where they're very likely to happen, to do an equality impact assessment as part of that final proposal they put in.
You mentioned the more fast-paced nature of Agile Sprints, kind of looking at 6 months to a year versus longer projects that take about 2 to 3 years. How do you ensure that in that fast-paced culture, that the research aligns with current policy windows?
Yes, I mean, that's really, for me, that's the point of the pace, is that we stay relevant and timely. And so as a question is expressed, as a need is expressed, of course, this is a bit of a generalization, but I think in general, that need needs to be met within months rather than years normally. And so part of the reason we're sort of in a rush is that if we've identified a need, and that's coming from industry, NGOs or public sector, that need won't be there in 2 years' time in the same way. Even if it's a fundamental need that will probably exist, the ways that we might address it and the processes we might feed into will have changed.
Do you have an example where findings from one of your sprints have influenced policy decision-making?
There's two examples I'd want to flag. One is a kind of a national, or maybe even at international level, and one at a more local level. So the national one, we had a sprint looking specifically at Brazil and its net zero scenarios and the role of deforestation and agriculture, sort of land use, in Brazil's net zero targets. So we did a piece of work, this is led by Alina Sotteroni, where she led a piece of work where she was modeling the net zero scenarios in Brazil. What then took that to the level of like real instrumental use of that modeling work, of that research, was that she'd managed to convince the Brazilian government that this was of such use. And of course, there was a change in leadership. There's an election a couple of years ago in Brazil, and we had a change in president, that meant that actually Alina was seconded into the government to work on that modeling with the specific aim being the Brazilian government could use that modeling to inform its nationally determined contributions, its NDCs, as part of this wider climate work. So that's a nice example where I think you see a piece of modeling be focused on what is useful for policymakers, and then they recognize that to such a degree that they actually then want that researcher to be inside government to inform their decisions directly internally. Another example, slightly completely different in nature, at a much more smaller scale, is we have a sprint that's all around biodiversity net gain. So we did a whole lot of very academic work around that topic, but we also produced a piece of guidance for developers and for local planning authorities to use to assess biodiversity net gain proposals. And so I think that's a really nice example of like a specific output, which is then not in a tool standard It's not a paper. It's not even a policy brief. It goes much more granular and specific. It's a guidance for how to assess a specific type of document, which is then going to be used over and over again by local planning authorities.
So I'd like to focus a little bit on impact and feedback processes and so on. So how do you make sure that there is continual improvement in the ways that research influences policy through the Agile Initiative? And how do you sort of measure feedback and implement feedback effectively within the sprints?
Yeah. No, I'm very pleased to say we do a lot on this, both at the kind of program level and then within individual sprints. So there's within individual sprints, there's a reasonably formal kind of process of checking in with sprints on their progress. So individually, there's that process, but I hope that process is more framed around learning and reflection rather than a kind of accountability or kind of checking in on people. At the wider program level, there's that kind of a similar process. Of course, we have a monitoring, evaluation, and learning whole toolbox of things we're doing there, both for ourselves for learning, but also on a more accountability type mode for our funder, for NERC and UKRI. We report to them regularly on a whole bunch of indicators on what we're doing. And then lastly, I think, and this is the bit that's maybe more unusual or more unique to Agile, maybe not, is that we have a whole set of work which we refer to as our program level research, which is where we're really asking these much more meta questions about what is this emerging Agile model? What are the commonalities between these sprints? Like really reflecting on those questions, asking this researchers, asking the stakeholders, is this working? If it is, why? If not, why things might be going wrong? And so this kind of almost evaluating the Agile module.
How can researchers get involved with the Agile Initiative?
Yeah, there's a long list between just signing up for our newsletter. It's the kind of most basic thing, emailing me or some of my colleagues and just asking us the questions you think we're not very clear about or just get in touch. There's lots of events we run. There's a check the events page. They're often online, so people anywhere can join. And then lastly, the kind of real deep engagement might be, actually getting involved in one of our sprints. If you're a researcher at Oxford, then that should be easy to, you can become part of those in a quite simple way and can be funded directly and can lead sprints. If you're a researcher at another institution, I think it's really important to say, we do fund and want to fund researchers at other organizations. You just need to be involved with someone who's leading a sprint who's based at Oxford.